I'm going to ask Valerie Keller, founder and CEO of Veritas, to come up and join me to give a closing perspective just on how you face complexity, how you understand it and deal with it in your world. And that'll get us thinking as we go into the afternoon about how to make sense of this.
Listen? Yes. Thank you. So I figured out that this must be an initiation ritual for the new YGLs. Stick them at the end of a really awesome morning session and right before lunch when everybody's starving. So I am very aware of that and appreciate the opportunity just to try and maybe put something in kind of a practical, tactical perspective for us. We've looked at it from a very macro view. We've been looking at lots of slides and bubbles and lines and the connections. And so what I would invite us to do now is to take a little bit of a journey from the human perspective. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about doing in these complex systems is impacting people's lives, the people that we know and the people in our communities. So I invite you to come along with me on a journey through one system and a story that I hope will highlight some opportunities and some frameworks for you, for each of us in our own communities as we start to say, okay, how can I affect systems? How can I affect change? And why? Because all of us have a limited time on this planet. We want to make an impact, and systems change is an amazing, powerful way to be able to do that. So I'm going to simplify a little bit here. I think at the end of the day, systems change isn't rocket science, that it is simple. And I think it's interesting also to look at it from my journey perspective was in the U.S. context. And I think that's also helpful when we look at systems because the U.S. doesn't have a problem of resource scarcity, right? So if we're not meeting human needs in our perspective, it's because we have a system failure. And why do we have a system failure? It's because we have a leadership failure. Because I don't think that we're scarce on money, and I don't think we're scarce on ideas. So in terms of looking at it as kind of a case study, you can't say, well, they just didn't have the resources, and that's why you have a system failure. No, it boils down to leadership. So I think the case that I'd like to look at here is one of poverty and homelessness. I started my journey out at the tender age of early 20s when I was very young and naive and met a woman very similar to this woman. I'm going to call Wilma because she reminds me of my great-grandmother Wilma, and that's how I started on the journey of homelessness and poverty. I met a woman like this in my community who was homeless, and it blew my mind. I thought, this can't be happening. I can't live a life as a fulfilled human being when a woman like this, like Wilma, is on the streets in my community. And so that's the journey that I started. And when looking at poverty and homelessness, I literally started running homeless shelters and realized, too, that we had a very wide, diverse look at what is homelessness. But if we want to look at a system failure, we can also say, okay, we have limited time, limited resources. What is the highest cost that we're seeing for the lowest return? And so the focus that I'm going to bring us through in this case study is the chronic homeless, is people like Wilma who repeatedly cycle through the different systems and the impact that that has on lives. So we see the phenomena called 3 hots and a cot. People basically that are seeking 3 hot meals a day and a place to sleep, right? And they cycle through the system repeatedly looking for shelters. So they go into shelters, right, where it's a jack of all trades, master of none, good people trying to do good work, scarce resources, can only stay for a limited period of time. So Wilma's back out on the streets, and maybe Wilma gets picked up for loitering. Right? Or maybe she gets picked up for drunkenness of some sort if she doesn't have a public support system there. So Wilma goes to jail. She costs money in jail. The sheriffs are dealing with her. They're not really set. She's not really a criminal, but she's there anyway. And so Wilma gets released, let's say after 12 to 14 days. She goes back out to the streets, and it's cold. So she gets sick, and she ends up in the ER, which is our most expensive way to provide health care for Wilma, right? And the cycle begins over and over and over again. In fact, many of you may have actually read the story that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about $1 Million Murray. And I use Murray here also as another example because veterans are a disproportionate percentage of the population, which I think is absolutely disgusting, that we have people who serve our country and then end up on the streets. And as you may have remembered in Malcolm Gladwell's article in The New Yorker, he said that in 10 years' time, the taxpayers had paid $1 million for Murray to die on the streets. It cost us $1 million not to take care of Murray. So there's a human cost, and there's obviously clearly an economic cost. So what are the implications for us? What are the options? Again, it's not rocket science in this particular system. There are best practices. There were things that we could implement. The ideas are out there. It called for new perspectives, a new paradigm, and a plan. So simply in this case, in this example, let's end homelessness. That's a crazy idea, right? I mean, let's stop managing this and cycling people from shelter to system. Let's end homelessness. And that turning the paradigm on its head and finding other people who are in my situation going, this is crazy. Why are we doing this? We're supposed to be ending homelessness and nobody's talking about that. So finding like-minded people, turning the paradigm on its head, and making the problem tangible and doable. So we've got, let's say, 300,000 chronic homeless people in the U.S. Let's target our 3,000 of our most vulnerable people within our particular region was the New Orleans area. If you're working on poverty in the U.S., highest concentration per capita is in the South. And let's look at what's being done elsewhere. What are the pilots that are working? We don't have to reinvent the wheel and be experts. And the same thing in the systems that you're in, the ideas are out there. And there were solutions that said, I don't know, if you want to end homelessness, here's an idea, put people in housing. That's a good one. You, of course, can't just put people in housing. You have to provide supportive services, and maybe Wilma can't earn money, so there needs to be some rent subsidies. But it's really not that complicated at the end of the day. And by the way, studies show that if you do that, not only is the community going to do better, Wilma's going to feel a lot better about it, and you're going to save the taxpayers on average $16,000 a year. So this was the plan that we had already kind of had percolating in place, and like any other system, of course you run into barriers, right? Anybody went NIMBYism? What is it? Not in my backyard. I don't want housing for people like that in my community. And we're going to have increasing elderly population. There's going to be more of them. Not finger pointing. It's not my problem. The business community. Why are these people on my streets? Get them out. This isn't my issue. The homeless people at shelters, they need to be taking care of this. Call the cops. This isn't my problem. The cops say this isn't my problem. Why isn't the state doing this? And one of the biggest things that I think we'll face in all of the systems that we're facing is inertia. Right? There's a lot of status quo, there's a lot of, it is the way it is, we can't change things, etc. We had a little bit of a help here. I'll call it a help. On August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. So we went from having a population of several thousand homeless people to having 275,000 homes destroyed, and to having 70% increase in the homeless population in New Orleans, where at one point in the New Orleans area, 1 in 25 people was homeless. It wasn't a problem to get people to pay attention to this issue anymore. And we had the plans ready. And so that led us to say, okay, now how? We've got a moment of opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. We're going to affect systems change now. The how in systems change really relates down to the who. It's people. It's people in positions of power. It's people who are experiencing the pain. And to Peggy's exact point, it's who are the stakeholders, right? So in our example, we said, okay, what are the pain points and who has the power? Pain points were hospital administrators. This is costing them a lot of money to have people cycling through their systems. Sheriffs, people, the business community, right? Loss of income for the business community. And we built a big tent. We said, what are the existing platforms we can use, but let's also build new ones. We formed coalitions, and what we call the suits and the sandals. We put the business community together with all the activists and the NGO people and the faith community, and we talked a common language in what people could hear that they needed to hear that meant for them. So we look for new stakeholders. Again, to Peggy's point, we said, okay, landlords, they'll benefit from this. They get rent that's going to be coming to them. Developers, we need more housing. They need a little bit of incentives to be able to do that. If they get some support, then they're going to benefit. And we also leverage national think tanks. So it was working at the local, the state, and the federal level all the way through. And very importantly, I think for systems change as well, we left out people who were going to be threatened by this. We left out substitutes, and I left out with slowdowns. So I say substitutes in this case was the shelters, and slowdowns were government workers, employees, bureaucracies, government agencies. So if you looked at all the different entities in this system, if I could show you a bubble chart, you'd see all these federal agencies, housing, human services, healthcare, state agencies, et cetera, but those weren't really the lever points for us. We knew that if we could get the big wide tent and the community together, that really if we could get enough people with enough power that we could leverage media, and if we also leverage media and leverage people with the right connections, we could sway politicians and policy. So in our case, in our system, it was important to be able to sway Congress, and also we had new systems that had been created, the Louisiana Recovery Authority, which I was serving on at the time, and other people working as well. So we used the power that we had created by this wide coalition, and we said, who's got the connections with Senator so-and-so? Who can get us an article placed in the media? And let's put in place that not so difficult plan that we had thought through earlier in terms of systems change. So what we looked for and what we got was rent subsidies, so that people like Wilma, people like Murray, and also the foster children that are aging out of foster care, youth that are coming through the system, and old people were able to have their rent subsidized for a period of time, either permanently if they were disabled, or in addition to that, receiving supportive services, and also housing tax credits to stimulate the private market. Again, these were just the points within this particular system, but it was the things that needed to come together to be able to get people off the streets. Something else was needed, though. A technological stitching together, a platform. You don't have transparency in a lot of systems, right? People aren't working together across it. So this was a whole other systems change with a whole lot of other incumbent interests and consultants who had gigs and they had deals that they were contracting with the Department of Social Services and this organization, that organization, and it was hard to be able to get everybody to align and integrate their technology platforms, but it was key. And again, the way that we went about this was with coalitions. So at the end of the day, in this particular example, we were able to create a national model. There's been a 39% decrease in chronic homelessness since 2005. That's phenomenal, and it's actually still very doable. There's only 107,000 approximately chronic homeless people within the US system. And I think the ultimate point is that we keep talking about systems change, systems change, systems change. At the end of the day, it goes down to people's lives are changed. They have dignity and they're fulfilled. And I'm not just talking about Wilma and Murray now, I'm talking about our community, I'm talking about us. That when we take care of our people in need, we benefit from that. We are whole. And that was really, I believe, the true outcome of this particular change. Okay, I wanted to just make one quick point about failures of system change. And when you looked at the picture earlier of Wilma, when I would walk by the street now and I see a chronic homeless person on the street, I see an individual, but I also see a broken system. And when I look at this house right here, rebuilt post-Katrina, I see a broken system all over the place. There was no plan, there was no process, there was no leadership. And so you ended up, and I know Cameron Sinclair and others who may have worked on housing issues or redevelopment issues post-Katrina know that you ended up having houses built way off the grid with no infrastructure, no supportive services, randomly put up at certain heights because nobody had determined what the regulations were on how high things needed to be. Insurance companies didn't know, so people were building way higher than they needed to be, which meant they ran out of money faster. It was completely dysfunctional. I love New Orleans. I want you all to come to New Orleans. I don't live there anymore. I'm in New York, but I would love you to come to New Orleans. But it is still an example of systems change. And ultimately, who controls systems and who can impact it? And it's the leaders. And I'm not picking on the three pictured here, but I think it's an important photo because it shows people at the local level, Ray Nagin, right there on the left, President George W. Bush, and with all due respect, a friend of mine, Governor Kathleen Blanco. And I say, again, with all due respect, it was a failure of leadership. They didn't move. They didn't work together. And the people within them, the people below them didn't work together either. I think that's important for us to keep in mind, considering that some of us may be the ones standing behind that podium one day. And so that leads up to my first point of lessons learned. Act. No paralysis of analysis. So we've been sitting in these conversations, we've been looking at these grids. Ultimately, we all have some kind of thing that interests us, and we can start. We can engage. Because ultimately, it's about our passion and not our platform. Within this system that I was working in, I had almost no power. I was a CEO of a social enterprise, an NGO, working at the local level. It was the most powerless position within the system. We built power, we created coalitions, we found the people with power, but it ultimately was about the passion. And that's why I say that even if you're not standing behind that podium, we all have the ability to influence a system. And we can do that by starting from anywhere and going everywhere. And that's another kind of takeaway within any system that I've seen. That doesn't matter where you're within the government system, within a business, within an NGO, where you are in the hierarchy. The point is that you can start to influence a system change as long as you're working through and over and around. And in order to do that, you have to have fluency, right? We have to be able to speak the languages in the win-win. We told the business community, this makes good business sense for you. We told the faith community, this is a moral imperative. And they stood up and said, yes, this is a moral imperative. And we told Congress, boy, this is going to be really good for you, and this person might help get you reelected. So it was speaking people's languages that they needed to hear. And at the end of the day, it was important to be able to stick and to stay, because these are systems changes. They don't happen overnight. There's a lot of things in place that keep them in place, right? And it's important to stick and to stay in order to be able to change lives. And that's kind of the last piece that I want to leave us with, is that we all have, whether you're interested in the economy or the environment or financial systems, is that we all have people who are counting on us to be able to make a difference. And I invite you to join us on the systems change journey. Thank you.
Thank you.